Dr. Elizabeth Warren had spent 2 decades examining thousands of vintage photographs as a historical artifact specialist at the New York Historical Society. But few pieces had ever arrived with such meticulous documentation of provenance. The sepia-tone portrait before her depicted 5 siblings, posed with stately composure in a parlor, their attire unmistakably Edwardian, exuding wealth and stature. The men were clad in sharply pressed suits with high collars, while the women wore elaborate gowns adorned with lace, their hair styled in the graceful Gibson girl fashion. "This photograph has remained in our family for more than a century," explained Mrs. Catherine Morrison, the elderly woman who had carefully presented it to Elizabeth. The siblings commissioned it in 1903 to mark the transfer of their father's thriving textile business into the family trust. They held a prominent place in Philadelphia society then. Elizabeth acknowledged the statement with a nod, lifting her magnifying glass to study the clarity of the composition, which was remarkable for its time. The 5 figures were arranged with precision, 2 brothers standing at either end and 3 sisters in the center, each appearing to be in their 20s or 30s, their expressions radiating confidence, pride, and the dignity of a family that had worked tirelessly to secure its success. Yet as Elizabeth's trained eye swept across the photograph, she noticed something unusual. On the leftmost figure, the youngest-looking sister there, was a detail that caused her to pause. The woman's left ear bore what seemed to be a disfigurement or scar, artfully obscured by her styled hair, but still visible under scrutiny. Adjusting her lighting and equipment, Elizabeth examined the area with renewed focus before speaking in a careful tone. "Mrs. Morrison, tell me everything you know about the youngest sister in this photograph." The elderly woman shifted uneasily, her hands trembling slightly as they toyed with the clasp of her handbag. At 92, Catherine carried herself with the unmistakable poise of one raised within Philadelphia's entrenched society. But the question seemed to touch on something she was reluctant to reveal. Elizabeth could see the flicker of hesitation in Catherine's eyes, a subtle betrayal of long-guarded family secrets. The youngest was named Clara. Catherine began, at last, her voice trembling yet resolute. "She was my great-grandmother's sister, and while she was dearly loved, she was different from the others. Not in a shameful sense, you must understand, but she faced challenges that the family rarely spoke of aloud." Elizabeth adjusted the angle of the light across the photograph, the shadows altering the fine details of Clara's face. What she had first assumed to be a natural scar now seemed more deliberate, as if some medical intervention had altered the structure of the young woman's ear. "What kind of challenges?" Elizabeth asked softly, noting every detail of the anomaly with precise care. Catherine exhaled, her silence stretching until she finally surrendered the truth. Clara, she explained, had been born with a severe deformity of the inner ear, leaving her functionally deaf. For families of stature in that era, such conditions were often regarded with quiet embarrassment, concealed from society whenever possible. Yet Clara had never allowed herself to fade into the margins. Elizabeth lifted her gaze from the magnifying glass, studying the photograph with fresh perspective. Clara stood seamlessly among her siblings, her posture unforced, her presence dignified. "It's unusual," Elizabeth remarked. "Many with hearing impairments at that time would have been left apart from moments like this." Catherine's voice grew steadier as she continued. "Clara's determination had been remarkable," she explained. "She taught herself to read lips with uncanny precision, developing a rare ability to interpret not only words, but also the emotions and intentions that flickered across a face or lingered in body language." Returning her focus to the image, Elizabeth noticed Clara's subtle head tilt, angled just so toward her siblings, a calculated position designed to follow their words visually. "Mrs. Morrison," Elizabeth asked carefully, that mark on Clara's ear. "Are you certain it was congenital? It doesn't appear entirely natural." Catherine's composure faltered, her mask of calm slipping into unease. "That's precisely why I came to you," she admitted. "I need to know if the story I've been told about Clara is true." The next morning, Elizabeth immersed herself in the archives of the College of Physicians of Philadelphia, combing through brittle journals and clinical records. The reality she uncovered was sobering. At the turn of the century, knowledge of hearing loss was rudimentary at best, and treatments were crude. Families relied on ear trumpets, large conspicuous devices that amplified sound but marked the user with stigma. Surgical interventions were almost unheard of, for they were fraught with risk, often leading to infection and death. Yet buried among the reports, Elizabeth found the faint trace of innovation. A physician named Dr. Samuel Wright at Philadelphia General Hospital had begun experimenting with reconstructive surgical techniques, attempting to correct birth defects of the ear canal. His work was rare, perilous, and controversial, but it suggested that Clara's disfigurement might not have been natural at all, but the remnant of a daring and dangerous attempt to restore what nature had denied her. Wright's published papers from 1902 and 1903 described experimental attempts to treat congenital oral atresia, the absence or underdevelopment of the ear canal, by surgically creating artificial passages for sound. The methods were crude by modern standards, but in their time, they represented daring medical innovation. Wright had experimented with inserting small, custom-made metal tubes into patients' ear structures, essentially constructing mechanical canals that could channel sound into the inner ear. These early efforts, though dangerous and unpredictable, were groundbreaking for a field that had virtually no solutions for such conditions. Elizabeth found his clinical notes especially compelling. He had worked with several patients from affluent Philadelphia families, often under strict confidentiality agreements to protect reputations and preserve appearances in elite social circles. The operations were exorbitantly expensive, carried enormous risks of infection or failure, and produced inconsistent results. Yet for some patients, they yielded partial, sometimes significant restoration of hearing. Her pulse quickened when she came across a specific entry in Wright's 1903 journal. Patient C.M. Age 23. Congenital bilateral oral atresia. Experimental implantation of custom brass acoustic channel. Successful in left ear. Patient reports significant improvement in sound detection. Procedure remains confidential per family request. The initials matched the age aligned, and the year coincided precisely with the commissioning of the Morrison family portrait. It was tantalizing evidence, but Elizabeth knew she needed something more conclusive. She requested access to Dr. Wright's private archive, which had been donated to the College of Physicians following his death in 1924. With special permission, she examined boxes of fragile papers and leather-bound ledgers containing patient files that had been sealed for decades. What she uncovered was extraordinary. Wright had meticulously documented surgical techniques that would not become standard practice until the mid-20th century. His notes revealed a physician who was both visionary and reckless, catering almost exclusively to wealthy families, willing to take enormous risks to erase conditions considered socially embarrassing. In a file marked Confidential, Family M. Elizabeth found what she had been searching for, the detailed account of Clara Morrison's case. The record confirmed that Clara had been born with severe bilateral oral atresia and was functionally deaf. In early 1903, her family had brought her to Wright as a last resort, desperate for a solution. His notes described Clara in strikingly admiring terms. Patient demonstrates exceptional intelligence, possesses extraordinary observational acuity, compensates for auditory deficit through advanced lip reading and facial expression interpretation. Wright then detailed the surgery he performed. The construction of an artificial canal in Clara's left ear, using a finely crafted brass tube carefully designed to guide sound waves into the inner ear while bypassing the congenital blockage. For the first time, Elizabeth understood the significance of the mark she had noticed in the photograph. It wasn't simply a scar or deformity. It was the subtle trace of one of the earliest known reconstructive ear surgeries in American medical history, a bold and secretive attempt to give Clara the gift of hearing. Wright's post-operative notes painted a picture of cautious triumph. Patient reports significant improvement in auditory perception. Able to detect speech at normal conversational volumes when positioned to utilize artificial canal. Enhanced lip reading abilities, combined with partial hearing restoration, allow for nearly normal social interaction. For Clara, the implications were extraordinary. For the first time in her life, she could experience fragments of sound enough to blend with her already remarkable skills at reading lips and interpreting expressions, allowing her to move through society with far greater ease than before. Yet the same notes also revealed why the operation had been cloaked in secrecy. The procedure was experimental to the point of being untested, with no assurance of safety or longevity. Families who entrusted Wright with their children understood that discretion was paramount. Public disclosure could destroy his reputation, shame their households, and expose them to ridicule if the treatments failed. Silence was the price of innovation. Elizabeth's investigation drew her deeper into the social realities of Philadelphia in 1903, where disability was more than a personal hardship. It was a stigma that shaped lives and reputations. Deaf individuals were often mischaracterized as mentally deficient and pushed into institutions or excluded entirely from mainstream life. In the upper echelons of society, such conditions were seen as blemishes that could tarnish an entire family's status. The rise of the eugenics movement only compounded these pressures, framing disabilities as hereditary flaws that disqualified families from desirable marriage alliances or social advancement. For Clara's parents and siblings, Wright's experimental surgery was not merely a medical hope. It was a lifeline, a chance to preserve both their daughter's dignity and their family's social position. The brass tube faintly visible in Clara's ear became more than just a medical device. It was a testament to her family's determination to give her a semblance of normalcy at a time when society was determined to deny it. Elizabeth's research further revealed that Clara's case was not unique. Wright's records hinted at a discrete network of affluent Philadelphia families who had quietly pooled resources to support his work, forming what amounted to an early clandestine medical research consortium. By funding experimental treatments, they sought to safeguard their children's futures while shielding themselves from public scrutiny. This secrecy explained why Wright's pioneering contributions remained buried for so long. The families involved were not simply protecting their reputations, they were also safeguarding the legacy of a surgeon whose work challenged the boundaries of accepted medicine by decades. With this context in mind, Elizabeth returned to the family portrait. Clara's placement within the composition no longer appeared casual. Her slight tilt toward her siblings, her attentive expression, and the almost imperceptible evidence of surgery all spoke of a young woman whose presence in that parlor was itself a quiet act of defiance against the prejudices of her time. In this new light, Clara's presence in the family portrait took on profound significance. Rather than being sidelined or hidden away because of her deafness, she stood prominently among her siblings, her brass hearing device faintly visible as a testament to her family's refusal to accept the social barriers imposed on individuals with disabilities. The very feature that might have been considered shameful by the standards of 1903 was instead preserved in a formal, enduring image, an act of defiance against societal prejudice. Determined to understand the technical brilliance behind Wright's work, Elizabeth arranged a meeting with Dr. Patricia Chen, a modern otorhinolaryngologist at Jefferson University Hospital. When Elizabeth presented the enhanced photograph of Clara's ear alongside Wright's original surgical notes, Dr. Chen studied them with growing astonishment. What Dr. Wright achieved in 1903 was extraordinary, she remarked with deep respect. Constructing a functional artificial ear canal with the limited surgical tools and medical knowledge available at the time required not only extraordinary skill, but also remarkable innovation. Dr. Chen explained that Wright's brass tube essentially performed the same role as today's bone-anchored hearing aids. Yet, he had devised the concept nearly a century before such devices were introduced into clinical practice. His approach showed a sophisticated grasp of acoustic engineering principles long before they were formally established. The tube's placement was designed to optimize the conduction of sound, while simultaneously reducing the risk of infection, an exceptionally delicate balance, requiring both surgical precision and mechanical insight. What impressed Dr. Chen most was Wright's apparent success in solving problems that continue to challenge modern medicine. Creating a permanent opening between the external ear and the inner auditory structures is notoriously dangerous, as it can provide a pathway for chronic or even fatal infections. And yet Wright's record suggested that Clara lived with the brass device for years, apparently without major complications. Elizabeth listened as Dr. Chen outlined the factors that likely contributed to this success. Wright had coated the brass with a specialized finish that prevented tissue rejection and inflammation. He had also developed a careful maintenance protocol that allowed Clara to keep the device clean and functional. Most significantly, he recognized that complete restoration of normal hearing was not achievable. Instead, he designed a hybrid solution that combined modest auditory enhancement with Clara's already exceptional lip reading and observational skills. By aligning medical ingenuity with Clara's unique strengths, Wright had created not just a device, but a personalized system of communication, one that allowed her to engage in society with confidence, dignity, and independence. Dr. Chen explained that Clara would have experienced a rare, almost hybrid form of perception after the surgery hearing that was not fully natural, but vastly superior to silence. The brass tube would have given her directional auditory input from her left side, while her highly trained visual skills continued to provide a steady stream of information from faces, gestures, and movement. Together, this created what Dr. Chen described as a nearly superhuman awareness of her surroundings. Clara could follow a conversation from across a parlor simply by watching lips, all while catching subtle sounds that others might overlook. A door creaking, a whispered aside, a nervous sigh. Armed with this new appreciation for Clara's abilities, Elizabeth returned to Catherine Morrison to ask about her great-grandaunt's life after the surgery. Catherine's memories and inherited stories revealed a woman who had transformed her challenges into strengths. Clara never married, Catherine said, her voice thoughtful. For a woman of her station, that was unusual. But she poured her energy into the family's business interests, and she was brilliant at it. Clara managed the Morrison textile fortune with uncanny precision, consistently choosing ventures that flourished and avoiding those that failed. According to Catherine, her success was not simply a matter of luck or education. It was her gift for reading people. Clara could interpret the smallest flicker of expression or hesitation, seeing what others missed. Business partners often marveled at her uncanny ability to predict outcomes and judge character, so much so that whispers circulated that she could read minds. She seemed to know of deals, alliances, or even scandals before they became public leading, many to assume she maintained an extensive social network of informants. But Catherine, reflecting on what Elizabeth had uncovered, now wondered if Clara's true gift was not connections, but perception. Elizabeth realized the implications. Clara's combined skills, extraordinary lip reading, sharpened observation, and partial hearing restoration had effectively made her an early social intelligence analyst, decades before the concept even existed. She could track conversations in crowded parlors, discern motives from the smallest facial shifts, and overhear whispers others dismissed as private. In the elite social and business circles of early 20th century Philadelphia, Clara Morrison had wielded abilities that allowed her to navigate power with rare and formidable insight. Catherine went on to reveal another dimension of Clara's life, one that had remained hidden even from most of her own family. Although she never publicly acknowledged her disability, Clara had quietly become a benefactor for others who struggled with similar challenges. She had anonymously funded educational programs for deaf children and discreetly provided financial support to families pursuing experimental medical treatments, a legacy of compassion that ran parallel to her success in business. When Clara died in 1962, she left behind 3 leather-bound journals filled with her distinctive, difficult handwriting. "I was never able to read them in full," Catherine admitted. Much of it looked like technical notes about hearing and sound. "But now, after what you've uncovered, I wonder if those volumes hold records of Dr. Wright's work." The following week, Catherine arrived at Elizabeth's office with the journals in hand. As Elizabeth turned their pages, she quickly realized that these were not simply private reflections, but a meticulous record of Clara's life with Wright's experimental hearing device. Clara had documented everything: the daily function of the brass tube, subtle changes in her auditory perception, cleaning and maintenance protocols, and even careful sketches of its design. More than a patient, she had assumed the role of researcher, recording her experiences with the precision of a scientist. One entry from 1905 leapt out at Elizabeth. Clara described how the device allowed her to perceive sounds outside the normal human range. "The brass channel seems to resonate with certain high-pitched frequencies others cannot detect. I hear the whistle of kettles from 3 rooms away, and I sometimes overhear conversations through walls that others believe to be private." This discovery suggested that the device did more than approximate natural hearing. It enhanced her perception, granting her sensory access to a world others could not experience. Her journals also revealed the careful double life she chose to maintain. In a 1907 entry, Clara wrote, "Society believes that deaf individuals are incapable of full participation in business and social affairs. By preserving the illusion of normal hearing, I can disprove such prejudices while also leveraging the unique advantages my condition affords me." She was not merely surviving in a hostile social climate. She was consciously subverting it, wielding her abilities as both shield and weapon. Even more astonishing were her technical notes. Clara's lived experience with Wright's device allowed her to suggest practical improvements, alterations to the tube's shape for greater comfort, refinements to reduce infection risk, and adjustments that improved clarity of sound. Wright incorporated many of these innovations into later procedures, which meant Clara had directly influenced the evolution of medical techniques decades ahead of their time. As Elizabeth set the journals aside, she understood that Clara Morrison had not only been a beneficiary of medical innovation, but also an active collaborator. Far from being a hidden figure, she had shaped the trajectory of experimental surgery and advanced the understanding of hearing restoration long before the modern era, leaving behind a legacy that blurred the line between patient and pioneer. Elizabeth's investigation had brought to light a forgotten chapter of medical history, one that revealed both a bold experiment and the extraordinary woman who embodied its success. Dr. Samuel Wright's radical ear surgery, conducted in secrecy in 1903, had achieved results beyond what he himself had dared to hope. And Clara Morrison had become living proof that innovative intervention could change a life in ways that society of the time could neither comprehend nor accept. The brass tube faintly visible in the family portrait was no mere medical apparatus. It symbolized a groundbreaking partnership between a visionary surgeon and a determined patient, a collaboration that pushed the boundaries of early 20th century medicine. Clara's journals confirmed that Wright continued refining his techniques in the years that followed, treating several other patients with similar conditions. Yet his work met with fierce resistance from the medical establishment, which dismissed his unconventional methods as reckless. Eventually, he was forced to abandon these experiments and return to traditional practice, leaving his most remarkable successes, like Clara, shrouded in silence. For Clara, secrecy had been both protection and burden. To reveal her surgery would have shattered the illusion of normal hearing that allowed her to participate fully in the social and business worlds of Philadelphia. Her family's insistence on preserving that fiction safeguarded her reputation, but also ensured that Wright's pioneering innovations remained hidden for decades. In that sense, the photograph Elizabeth had examined was more than a simple family keepsake. It was evidence of a moment when medical science had quietly leapt ahead of its time. Clara's subtle tilt of the head, her attentive gaze, and the faint gleam of brass in her ear were visual proof that she was not just posing for a portrait. She was living with revolutionary technology that granted her access to a world previously denied. The brass tube represented nothing less than a triumph of ingenuity over limitation. Through the courage of a family willing to embrace risk, the brilliance of a surgeon, unafraid to defy convention, and the resilience of a young woman determined to seize her place in society, a medical innovation decades ahead of its time was born. Wright's work anticipated the principles behind cochlear implants and bone-anchored hearing aids, making Clara, in effect, one of the earliest examples of a human augmented by technology, an early cyborg of the Edwardian age. Recognizing the importance of this story, Elizabeth arranged for Clara's life and Wright's forgotten work to be featured in a major exhibition on hidden medical pioneers and the patients who helped shape the evolution of modern practice. When Elizabeth shared the full scope of her findings with Catherine Morrison, the elderly woman was deeply moved. All these years, Catherine said softly, "We thought Clara was simply a spinster who had been fortunate in business. Now I see she was a pioneer in her own right. A woman who proved that those society dismissed as incapable could achieve what others believed impossible." The exhibition would serve as a tribute not only to Dr. Wright's bold surgical innovation, but also to Clara's extraordinary courage in agreeing to a procedure that in her time could just as easily have ended in death or permanent disfigurement. Her leather-bound journals would be displayed beside the 1903 photograph, allowing visitors to see how a young woman had harnessed experimental technology to live a rich and successful life. All while carefully preserving the illusion of normalcy that protected both her privacy and her surgeon's reputation. Modern physicians who studied Wright's notes and Clara's meticulous documentation were astonished to find that elements of his techniques anticipated aspects of today's cochlear implants and bone-anchored hearing aids. Clara's detailed observations of daily life with an artificial hearing canal offered unique insights into long-term adaptation insights that still had relevance more than a century later. In this way, Clara was not merely a subject of medical history. She had become a contributor to modern practice, her lived experience informing treatments for patients yet unborn. But perhaps the most profound revelation was the way her story challenged long-standing assumptions about disability in the early 20th century. Clara's accomplishments in business and society showed that many of the limitations imposed on people with disabilities were not medical inevitabilities, but social constructs. With access to innovation, determination, and a supportive family, Clara had broken through barriers that her world assumed were absolute. The family portrait, once just a faded keepsake, now carried new meaning. The faint gleam of a brass hearing device in Clara's ear was no longer a curious imperfection, but a symbol of defiance, resilience, and human ingenuity. It represented the choice to push past stigma and limitation, to embrace science and risk in pursuit of a fuller life. As Elizabeth studied the photograph one final time, her perception of Clara crystallized. She no longer saw a woman merely managing to stand among her siblings, despite a hidden disability. She saw a pioneer, someone who used revolutionary technology to seize her rightful place in family, society, and history. The subtle tilt of Clara's head was no longer just a pose for the camera. It was the captured image of a woman listening, observing and participating in her world through the combined power of surgical innovation and personal determination.